It is often said, my dear friends, that the deepest wounds are not visible to the eye, but rather etch themselves upon the soul, carving out hollow spaces where light once resided. Such was the case with Michael Callahan, a man I have known since the first blush of his boyhood, a soul I watched dim and harden over the cruel passage of a decade. He is, in many ways, the very heart of this story I wish to share with you, a testament to God's persistent grace, even when we turn our backs and bolt the doors of our hearts against Him. I first knew Michael as a bright-eyed altar boy here at St. Michael the Archangel Parish. Oh, he was a splendid lad, with a quick smile and an earnestness that warmed the very sacristy. He moved with a quiet reverence during Mass, his small hands carefully tending the chalice and paten, his young voice ringing clear and true as he responded to the prayers. He wasn't just going through the motions. You could see the simple, powerful faith shining in him like a freshly lit candle. He loved the stories of the saints, especially his namesake, the Archangel Michael, and he spoke often of wanting to serve others, to be a protector, a bulwark against the darkness. His faith was a sturdy oak, rooted deep in the fertile ground of a loving family and a community that cherished him. It was a joy to watch him grow, to witness the unfolding of a spirit so open to God's embrace. I remember once, after a particularly solemn Good Friday service, he stayed behind, polishing the brass crucifix with such tender care, a tear silently tracing a path down his cheek. "Father," he'd whispered, his voice thick with a child's profound empathy. How could they hurt him so? His connection to the suffering Christ was palpable, a testament to the purity of his young faith. Then, the world showed him its own cruelties. 10 years ago, the very thing he aspired to be, a protector, became the instrument of his deepest sorrow. His younger brother, David, followed Michael into the fire service, a young man with the same bright smile and an equally robust faith. They were inseparable, two halves of a whole, united by their call to serve and their shared, unshakable belief. But a warehouse blaze, a sudden, unexpected structural collapse, stole David from us, leaving behind only an aching void and a brother consumed by a grief that curdled into something far more dangerous, a profound and bitter anger at God. I remember that funeral like it was yesterday, the air thick with smoke from the fire still clinging to the firefighters' uniforms, mingling with the heavy scent of lilies. Michael, standing by the casket, was a statue carved from granite, his eyes dry, but holding a universe of pain. I saw the light go out in him, not with a flicker, but with a sudden, extinguishing gasp. The simple faith that had defined him, the sturdy oak, was struck by lightning, leaving behind a charred, hollow trunk. He bore the weight of his family's grief with a grim stoicism, but I knew, as only a pastor who has walked beside souls in their darkest valleys can know, that he carried a heavier burden, the death of his own spirit. In the years that followed, Michael Callahan became, by all accounts, an exemplary man. He climbed the ranks of the fire department with a chilling efficiency, earning a reputation as the best firefighter in the county. Fearless, methodical, decisive, his colleagues respected him, looked up to him. He was often the first into the inferno, the last to leave, moving through chaos with an unnerving calm. He saved countless lives, pulled families from burning homes, and navigated smoke-filled labyrinths with an almost preternatural instinct. His body was lean, strong, a finely tuned machine, and his mind, sharp and analytical, could assess a situation in seconds. But beneath that impressive exterior, I saw what others couldn't, or perhaps chose not to see. His soul was hollow. He performed his duties, not with passion or the joyous self-sacrifice that once defined him, but with a cold, precise detachment. He was a man running on procedure and muscle memory, every action perfected, every risk calculated, yet devoid of the vibrant spirit that once animated him. The warmth, the joy, the empathy that had once been his hallmarks had been replaced by a kind of functional emptiness. He lived, he worked, he saved lives, but he did not live in the way God intended us to, with open heart, with hope, with connection to the divine. The light had gone out, leaving only echoes in its place. He still came to Mass, of course, on Christmas and Easter, for his mother's sake. A good son, always. But he would slip into the back pew just as the opening hymn began, a shadowy figure against the stained glass light. He never made eye contact, never lingered for the fellowship coffee. His posture was rigid, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the altar, perhaps on the distant past or an unknowable future. His heart, once so open and trusting, had become a fortress against the grace he no longer believed in, a citadel of grief and unanswered questions. The sacred words, the familiar rituals, the very presence of the Eucharist, they seemed to wash over him without penetrating the thick walls he had erected around himself. It was as if he was present in body, but his spirit remained miles away, adrift in a sea of his own making. I tried to reach him many times. After a Christmas vigil Mass, I'd try to catch his eye, offer a gentle word. "Michael, it's good to see you," I'd begin, a hopeful tremor in my voice. He would offer a polite nod, perhaps a quick, almost imperceptible dip of his chin, but his eyes, the windows to the soul, remained shuttered. He would offer a perfunctory, "Merry Christmas, Father," and then pivot smoothly, disappearing into the departing crowd before I could offer more than a fleeting blessing. I'd send cards at Easter, a gentle note of remembrance on the anniversary of David's passing. He'd always acknowledge them, often through his mother, a distant "thank you." But he politely kept me, and, by extension, God, at a distance, maintaining a meticulous perimeter around his guarded heart. I understood, of course, the profound nature of his pain. I understood the anger, the feeling of abandonment, the sheer injustice of it all. It is a terrible thing to witness a young life extinguished, and even more terrible to watch a vibrant faith wither in its wake. My heart ached for him, not with judgment, but with a deep paternal sorrow for the beautiful spirit that had been so cruelly wounded. I prayed for him, constantly, during my morning meditations, during the holy sacrifice of the Mass, asking God to somehow, someday, break through the formidable walls Michael had built. I prayed that the boy who once polished the crucifix with tears of empathy might somehow find his way back to the solace of the cross, that the man of procedure might remember the man of faith, for I knew, with the certainty of long experience, that no amount of professional accomplishment, no number of lives saved, could fill the cavernous emptiness within a soul that had lost its connection to its Creator. Michael Callahan was a hero to our town, an indispensable force against the dangers that threatened us, but he was also a lost lamb, wandering in a wilderness of his own making, desperately needing to be found. And so I waited and I prayed, hoping that perhaps in God's own mysterious time, a new spark might ignite within the hollow man. I waited and I prayed, much as I had done countless times before, each petition a quiet whisper into the vastness of God's mysterious plan. I hoped that perhaps, in God's own mysterious time, a new spark might ignite within the hollow man, the boy who once held the chalice with such reverence. But the path to a soul's awakening, as I have learned in my long years of priesthood, is rarely straightforward. Sometimes it demands a cataclysm. It was a cold, cruel autumn night, the kind that bites at your bones and whispers of winter's coming dominion. A blustery wind rattled the old rectory windows, pulling at the branches of the ancient oak outside, a skeletal dance against the moonless sky. I had just settled into my worn armchair with my breviary, the day's duties finally concluded, when the shrill, insistent ring of the telephone shattered the quiet. My heart, accustomed to the nocturnal alarms of pastoral life, a sick call, a sudden death, gave an immediate heavy thump. "Father Michael?" The voice on the other end was raspy, strained. It was Chief Miller, his usual gruffness replaced by a tremor I'd rarely heard. It's St. Jude's." The name hung in the air, a physical blow. St. Jude's. Not just any church, but the venerable cornerstone of our town's faith, a building that had stood sentinel on the highest hill for over a century and a half. It had weathered storms and served generations, a silent witness to countless joys and sorrows. It was where my own grandparents had been married, where I had first received the Eucharist as a boy, a place imbued with the collective memories and prayers of our entire community. "What about it, Chief?" I managed, though a cold dread was already coiling in my stomach. She's engulfed, Father. The whole damn place. Just got the call. Michael and his company are already en route." His voice cracked. "It's bad, Father. Real bad." I dropped the receiver into its cradle, my hand trembling, engulfed. The word echoed like a death knell. I pulled on my coat, fumbling with the buttons, my mind a whirl of disbelief and sorrow. As I hurried out into the biting night, I could already smell it. The unmistakable acrid scent of burning timber and plaster carried on the wind. Then, as I turned the corner onto Main Street, I saw it. A monstrous, malevolent glow pulsating against the charcoal sky, staining the clouds a furious orange and red. The beacon on the hill, which for so long had symbolized hope and solace, was now a roaring testament to destruction. My old car, usually a sedate companion, seemed to fly through the deserted streets. The closer I drew, the more pronounced the scene became. Sirens wailed, a mournful chorus against the roaring backdrop of the fire. Flashing red and blue lights painted the surrounding trees in an urgent, macabre ballet. And there it was, atop the hill, St. Jude's Chapel, a grand old matriarch now consumed by a ravenous beast. The sight stole the breath from my lungs. Flames, immense and terrifying, licked out of every shattered window, writhed around the venerable bell tower, and clawed at the slate roof. The intricate stained glass rose window, a masterpiece depicting the Pentecost, exploded in a shower of brilliant, incandescent fragments, each shard a tiny, searing memory of beauty lost. The very air vibrated with the immense heat, even from a distance, and the roar was deafening, a hungry, guttural sound that seemed to drown out the sirens, the shouted commands, even the anguished cries of the growing crowd of townsfolk who stood huddled behind the police tape, their faces illuminated by the inferno, etched with grief. My feet carried me through the milling crowd, a current of shared horror, until I reached the perimeter. Fire Chief Miller spotted me and waved me over, his face grim, streaked with soot. He didn't need to say anything. The devastation spoke volumes. This was not a fire to be contained. It was a battle for the very soul of a landmark, a battle it was clearly losing. And then I saw him, Michael Callahan. He was a stark silhouette against the heart of the conflagration, a figure of methodical efficiency amidst the surrounding chaos. He stood by his engine company's truck, issuing rapid, terse commands to his team as they connected hoses, his helmeted head turning, assessing, directing. His movements were precise, economical, devoid of any wasted motion. The ferocious light of the flames danced upon his bunker gear, but his face, when he turned slightly towards the glowing inferno, was an unreadable mask. There was no terror, no despair, no frantic haste, only the chilling, almost inhuman focus of a man utterly consumed by his grim duty. My heart ached with a familiar pang. Here he was, the town's hero, fearless and formidable, doing what he did best. And yet, the very intensity of his professionalism in this moment of profound loss only served to underscore the hollow place within him. He moved like a perfectly calibrated machine, immune to the emotional weight of the tragedy unfolding before him. The church burned, a sacred space crumbled to ash, and Michael Callahan was simply processing an incident, applying procedure, mitigating damage. "They just finished the primary sweep, Father," Chief Miller said, his voice flat. Michael was first in, as always, brave as hell. I watched as Michael and his team emerged from a side entrance, their figures momentarily obscured by thick plumes of smoke, only to reappear, breathing heavily but steadily. They gave quick, decisive hand signals to others, and Michael spoke briefly into his radio before turning to the chief. His helmet was still on, but I could imagine the impassive set of his jaw beneath the brim. "Building's clear, Chief." Michael's voice, though muffled by his mask, carried a professional detachment. "No sign of anyone inside. Confirmed with Mr. Abernathy earlier. He locked up after evening prayer and went home directly. A collective sigh of profound, shuddering relief rippled through the small knot of firefighters and police officers gathered near us. Mine was among them. No lives lost. In the face of such utter destruction, it was the only solace we could cling to, a slender thread of grace in a night of overwhelming sorrow. Mr. Abernathy, our dear meticulous sacristan, a man whose life revolved around the rhythms of St. Jude's, was safe. The weight of potential human tragedy was lifted, if only to be replaced by another, more profound ache. But the relief was fleeting, quickly overshadowed by the immense, heartbreaking loss of the building itself, St. Jude's. I turned my gaze back to the burning edifice, feeling the heat on my face, watching the impossible unfold. The main altar, carved from Italian marble, surely must be cracking and crumbling. The beautiful wooden pews, where generations had knelt, now fuel for the ravenous flames. The statues, lovingly painted, the stations of the cross, each telling a story of suffering and redemption, all now dissolving into smoke and ash. My mind raced through memories. The solemnity of baptisms at the ornate font near the entrance, children welcomed into the fold. The joyous, hopeful vows exchanged before the altar during countless weddings. The quiet comfort of funerals, souls commended to God, amidst the gentle light filtering through the stained glass. This sacred space had been more than just bricks and mortar. It was the repository of our community's spiritual journey, a tangible link to our past, a promise for our future. It had been a place where sorrows were offered and graces received, where doubts were assuaged and faith rekindled. It was a home for the soul. Now, it was a tomb of fire, a tragic, irreplaceable loss of history, of beauty, of sacred space. Yet, amidst the horror, there was this singular, merciful grace. No human life had been taken. For that, I offered a silent, fervent prayer of thanksgiving. The building was gone. Yes, a devastating void left in its wake, but the precious spark of human life, God's most wondrous creation, had been spared. The fire continued its relentless work, its roar a mournful lament for all that was being consumed. The bell tower, now a skeletal spire of blazing timber, groaned ominously, threatening to collapse at any moment. The nave, the central body of the church, was a lost cause, a cauldron of superheated gas and falling debris. Chief Miller was already barking new orders, instructing the crews to pull back, to establish a perimeter, and fight the blaze from the exterior. It was a tactical retreat, an admission that the battle for the interior was over. All that remained was to contain the destruction, to prevent the fire from spreading to the neighboring houses, to let the inferno exhaust itself, leaving behind only smoldering ruins and broken memories. The firefighters, including Michael and his company, began to reposition, their movements now less urgent, more focused on containing the perimeter. Hoses were aimed, streams of water arced through the smoke-filled air, striking the outer walls, cooling the edges of the raging beast. It was in this moment of controlled chaos, with the main body of the church a lost cause, a monument to the unholy power of destruction, that everything shifted. This was the precise instant, I would later realize, when the ordinary laws of the world began to bend, preparing for a divine intervention no one could have possibly foreseen. The fire had taken everything, but it was not yet finished revealing God's mysterious hand. The fire had taken everything, but it was not yet finished revealing God's mysterious hand. The chief's voice, a familiar baritone that usually cut through the cacophony of an emergency with crisp authority, now held a note of profound resignation. "Pull back, boys. Consolidate lines. Fight this from the exterior." His arms swept in a weary arc, indicating the periphery of the property. Bell towers unstable. Naves a lost cause. We save what we can around it. A collective sigh, almost imperceptible beneath the roar of the blaze, seemed to ripple through the assembly of firefighters. It was the sound of a battle lost, the acknowledgement of defeat in the face of an insurmountable adversary. St. Jude's, our beloved sentinel on the hill, was doomed. My own heart sank with the chief's words. A dull, aching thud against my ribs. I had been praying, not for a miracle to quench the inferno, for even in my faith I understood the terrible logic of thermodynamics, but for strength, for peace, for the safeguarding of any souls who might, impossibly, still be within. Now, even that last, faint hope was extinguished. The logic of the fire, its hungry maw consuming century-old timber and stone, had won. All that remained was the grim, methodical work of containment, preventing the tragedy from metastasizing into a broader devastation for our quiet town. The firefighters began to reposition, their movements shifting from the frantic urgency of a primary assault to the more deliberate, systematic rhythm of defense. Hoses that had earlier been directed at the gaping maw of the entrance were now carefully maneuvered, arcing powerful streams of water high into the smoke-choked air to douse the outer walls, to cool the blistering edges of the raging beast. They were building a watery perimeter, a line in the sand against the relentless march of destruction. The air was thick with the smell of scorched wood, wet ash, and the metallic tang of superheated air, punctuated by the relentless hiss and crackle of flames devouring everything in their path. Sirens, now fewer and farther between, wailed a mournful counterpoint to the fire's own guttural symphony. The scene was one of controlled chaos, a disciplined dance on the precipice of ruin, where every man moved with the practiced, almost mechanical efficiency born of countless drills and the grim reality of true emergencies. They were heroes, every one of them, tirelessly battling a force that defied their strength. I remained on the periphery, watching, praying, a silent witness. The heat was still intense. Even at this distance, a palpable weight on my skin. My eyes, red-rimmed from smoke and unshed tears, scanned the faces of the men, searching, I suppose, for a sign of, well, of what? Of grace? Of understanding? Of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of such profound loss? I watched Michael Callahan, as I always did. He stood by his pumper truck, a stoic silhouette against the inferno's orange glow, methodically checking gauges, coiling a hose, his face still an unreadable mask. He was precisely where he was supposed to be, doing precisely what he was trained to do. The hollow man, efficient to a fault, a machine of duty. And then it happened. It was subtle at first, a ripple in the fabric of the ordered chaos. Michael, in the midst of securing a length of hose, his movements, fluid and precise, suddenly went rigid. His back stiffened, his shoulders pulled taut, and his hands, which had been deftly coiling the heavy rubber, froze mid-air, clenching into fists. It was as if an invisible, sudden force had seized him, locking him into place. I watched, my priestly instinct for human suffering immediately alert, sensing a shift, a tremor in the expected order of things. His head, which had been bowed in concentration, slowly lifted. His gaze, usually so sharp and focused on the immediate task, now widened, expanding with a disbelief so profound it seemed to pull the very light from his eyes. They were no longer the calculating eyes of a seasoned firefighter, but the eyes of a man confronted with the utterly impossible. They were locked, absolutely fixated, on the very heart of the inferno itself, where the shattered rose window of St. Jude's once stood, where once intricate stained glass had depicted saints and angels, now only a gaping maw remained, framed by jagged, smoking remnants of stone. From this gaping wound in the church's facade, the flames roared, a furious, living entity, licking at the night sky. It was a crucible of destruction, a maelstrom of light and heat, the epicenter of the chapel's demise. Yet, Michael stared at it with an intensity that defied the logic of the scene. It wasn't the stare of someone assessing danger or planning a response. It was the stare of someone who had seen something that simply could not be. He took a step, then another, an almost imperceptible forward movement, drawing him inexorably towards the source of that terrible heat and light. It was a move against every protocol, every instinct for self-preservation that had been drilled into him over years of service. It was wrong, dangerously so. "Michael, what are you doing?" Captain Davies, A man whose gruff exterior hid a deep concern for his men reacted instantly. He was quicker than I, his hand shooting out, gripping Michael's arm, a solid anchor trying to reel him back from the precipice. But Michael didn't seem to notice the firm grip, nor the captain's urgent command. His body, though physically restrained, continued to lean, to strain, as if an invisible thread was tugging him into the heart of the conflagration. His eyes remained fixed, unblinking, on that vortex of fire and light. I was close enough, perhaps 30 feet away, sheltered by the relative safety of a parked ambulance, to observe the subtle tremor that now ran through his frame. His lips, caked with soot and dry from the heat, parted. They moved, barely, forming a soundless word, then a whisper, so faint it should have been swallowed entirely by the elemental roar surrounding us. But in that moment, in the strange, heightened awareness that grips one during such an emergency, I saw the exact articulation of his mouth. Did you hear that? The words, though barely audible, struck me with an unsettling force. They were not addressed to his captain, nor to any specific individual. They were a question breathed into the vast, consuming emptiness of the fire, into the very air thrumming with its destructive power. Captain Davies, his face a mask of concern and confusion, glanced around at the other firefighters who were now also looking at Michael. Their work momentarily paused. They exchanged bewildered shrugs. "Hear what, Michael?" the captain demanded, his voice strained with urgency. "All I hear is this damn fire." And indeed, that was all anyone else could hear. The relentless crackle and hiss of timber giving way, the muffled explosions as superheated gases ignited, the guttural roar that seemed to emanate from the very bowels of the earth. There was no other sound, no distinct voice, no anomaly amidst the terrible symphony of destruction. Yet, Michael's question hung in the air, a phantom sound only he had perceived. Then, his body, which had been struggling against Captain Davies's hold, abruptly ceased all movement. The subtle tremor stopped. His shoulders relaxed, but not in relief, rather in a sudden, absolute cessation of will. His gaze remained fixed on the shattered rose window, but the disbelief in his eyes was replaced by something else entirely. An eerie blankness, a profound stillness that was utterly out of place amidst the frantic activity. He froze, completely, like a statue carved from ash and despair, rooted to the spot, a silent, unmoving sentinel against the backdrop of consuming flames. The captain's hand still clutched his arm, but it was now merely a gesture, holding a man who had become unresponsive, distant, adrift in some private, incomprehensible space. The controlled chaos around us continued its relentless grind, but for Michael, and for me, watching him with a growing sense of dread and inexplicable awe, the world seemed to have stopped. Time itself stretched, thin and brittle, as we hovered on the cusp of something unfathomable. The fire, which had seemed to demand all our attention, now seemed merely a stage, a backdrop for a deeper, more profound mystery that had just begun to unfold within the spirit of one man. It was as if, in the very heart of that destruction, an unholy command, or perhaps a sacred summons, had just been whispered into Michael Callahan's hollowed soul. The roar of the inferno was a physical presence, a monstrous symphony of destruction that vibrated through the very ground beneath our feet. It was a primal sound, a hungry beast devouring ancient wood and consecrated stone, a chaotic chorus of snapping timbers, shrieking glass, and the ceaseless, ravenous crackle of 1,000 small fires coalescing into one vast, terrifying entity. The very air shimmered with the superheated turbulence, distorting the scene into a nightmarish canvas of orange and black. Yet, amidst that apocalyptic chorus, for Michael Callahan, and for me, watching him with a growing sense of dread and inexplicable awe, the world seemed to have stopped. My own breath caught in my throat, a silent prayer forming on my lips without conscious thought, as I witnessed a stillness descend upon him that defied the very chaos surrounding us. Time itself stretched, thin and brittle, as we hovered on the cusp of something unfathomable, something that transcended the physical devastation before our eyes. The fire, which had seemed to demand all our attention, now seemed merely a stage, a backdrop for a deeper, more profound mystery that had just begun to unfold within the spirit of one man. It was as if, in the very heart of that destruction, an unholy command, or perhaps a sacred summons, had just been whispered into Michael Callahan's hollowed soul, shattering the carefully constructed silence within him. Later, in the quiet, shadowed confession box of Sainting, Michael the Archangel, with the scent of old wood and incense clinging to the air like memories of countless absolutions, Michael would recount to me, his voice a raw whisper of wonder and terror, what transpired in those eternal moments. His shoulders were slumped, not with defeat, but with the immense weight of an experience that defied easy categorization. He sat across from me, the faint light filtering through the grill barely illuminating the tremor in his hands, which he clasped tightly, as if holding on to sanity itself. He spoke of how he stood there, as I saw him, frozen rigid, his eyes riveted, not on the swirling chaos of the collapsing bell tower, nor on the flickering danger of the superheated timbers, but on the very heart of the fire itself. The maw, where the sanctuary's magnificent rose window had once been. It was no longer a window, but a pulsating wound, a gateway to an unimaginable crucible of flame and light. He told me the initial shock was almost physical, a sudden, inexplicable stillness that descended upon his senses, silencing the external din even as it raged. It was like stepping into an anechoic chamber, a vacuum of sound where every other noise was suddenly muted, absorbed, rendered irrelevant. The primal roar of the fire, the urgent shouts of his crew, the distant wail of sirens, all faded into a distant, muffled hum, and in that profound, unnatural quiet, a voice emerged. "It wasn't loud, Father," he whispered, his eyes wide and distant, as if still gazing into the heart of that fiery window. Not like a shout. It was resonant, like a bell rung deep inside me, a pure, clear note that vibrated through my very bones, but clearer than any sound I've ever heard with my ears. As if it bypassed my ears entirely and spoke directly to my soul, to that hidden place within me I thought long dead, and the voice spoke his name, Michael. He said it wasn't a question, nor a command in the conventional sense. It was simply his name, pronounced with a calm authority, an intimacy that chilled him to the bone even as it resonated with a forgotten echo from his earliest childhood prayers. This was a man, remember, who had systematically walled off every avenue to the sacred for a decade. His faith had not merely dwindled, it had been actively dismantled, brick by painful brick, in the crucible of his brother's fiery death. He had seen the raw, unvarnished horror of the world, the seeming indifference of the heavens, and had chosen to believe only in what he could see, touch, and control. He was a man of logic, of procedure, of quantifiable risks and observable realities. The supernatural was a realm he had long since deemed empty, a solace for the weak, a cruel illusion designed to mask the universe's inherent randomness. He had buried his grief and his God simultaneously, constructing around his heart a fortress of stoic pragmatism, meticulously mortaring each stone with reason and bitter experience. So, his first, immediate reaction, he confessed, was a surge of panicked rationalization, a desperate scramble to find a logical explanation for the impossible. My mind instantly went to exhaustion, Father. The smoke, the heat, the adrenaline, the sheer weariness after hours on scene. I figured I was hallucinating, overstressed, pushing myself too hard. My brain was playing tricks on me, conjuring phantom sounds in the cacophony. He tried to shake it off, physically even. I could picture him, shaking his head slightly, perhaps even batting at an imaginary fly, trying to dislodge the impossible sound from his mind, to mentally recalibrate, to re-engage with the tangible, the immediate demands of the inferno before him. He tried to tell himself it was the wind whistling through the ruined nave, the creak of burning wood settling, the illusion of sound forming patterns in the roar, a trick of acoustics in the hollowed-out church. But the clarity of it, he insisted, the undeniable precision of his own name, defied all such attempts. It was undeniably a voice, and it was undeniably calling him. I could see, even then, the struggle on his face. He was an immovable rock of a man, his presence usually a testament to unwavering control. Yet in that instant I witnessed a tremor, a subtle fracture in his steely composure that sent a pang through my own heart. His eyes, usually so sharp and analytical, held a bewildered terror, a dawning horror that was deeper than any fear of the flames, deeper than any physical danger he faced. It was the terror of a rational man, confronted with the utterly irrational, the sacred breaking through the profane, not gently, but with the force of an unexpected earthquake, rending the very fabric of his perceived reality. He stood there, a solitary sentinel caught between two worlds, the roaring inferno before him and the silent, terrifying echo within, a man whose carefully constructed universe was suddenly, violently being rearranged. His captain, a gruff but caring man named Miller, I recall, finally released his arm, concern etched on his soot-streaked face. "Callahan, you all right, Mike? You're white as a sheet, son." Michael didn't respond, his gaze still fixed on that fiery vortex. He couldn't. His inner world was in freefall, the external world a distant, meaningless din. All his focus, all his being, was consumed by this impossible, unsettling communication. The captain's words barely registered, just another faint ripple in the profound stillness that had enveloped him. Then the voice came again. This time, it was not merely a call, but a summons. It carried with it a purpose, a directive that tore through the last vestiges of his self-imposed skepticism, stripping away his defenses like dry leaves in a storm. "Michael, the baptistery, my child is waiting." He recounted to me how the words resonated not as an external sound wave, but as an undeniable impression stamped directly onto the tablet of his consciousness, as vivid and undeniable as a memory, yet utterly new. It was clear, precise, and utterly impossible. "The baptistery, Father," he explained, his voice still edged with the memory of that moment, his hands now clenched into fists. "I knew that church inside and out. Every firefighter studies the blueprints. The baptistery was tucked into an alcove, just to the left of the main altar. By then, that entire section of the nave was a furnace. A literal, roaring furnace of collapsing timbers, superheated gases, embers raining down like molten hail, steam hissing from every stone as the water from our hoses turned instantly to vapor. To go there, it wasn't just against every order, every protocol, every instinct for self-preservation. It was suicide, plain and simple, Father, a death wish." He described a sudden, overwhelming image flashing through his mind, not of the baptistery as it once was, a place of cool marble and quiet reflection, but, as it was now, a gaping maw of fire, a crucible of destruction. He saw the heavy oak beams, groaning and splintering, their thick wood burning with a ferocious intensity. He imagined the ancient stained-glass windows depicting scenes of Christ's baptism, exploding inward from the unbearable heat, shards of colored glass becoming incandescent projectiles. He pictured the very stone walls weeping steam as they buckled under the immense thermal stress, the air within a suffocating, searing cauldron. His training, his years of experience, the solemn lessons learned from every tragedy, screamed at him. No one could survive in there. It was a death trap, a fool's errand. But the voice, the voice. This was where the terror morphed into something else entirely, something that transcended fear and plunged him into the profound depths of awe, unsettling the very foundation of his soul. He searched for menacing intent, for a hint of malevolence, for anything that might classify this as a demonic whisper, a trick of the adversary, a cruel illusion. But there was none. "It wasn't threatening, Father," he insisted, his eyes wide, remembering. "There was no malice, no demand, no coercion. It was imbued with an authority that was absolute, yes, but also infinitely loving, like a parent's firm hand guiding a child away from danger or towards something vital, something pure. It was an authority rooted in pure, unadulterated love, and that's what truly broke me. For Michael, the man who had closed himself off from love, especially divine love, for so long, this was the ultimate paradox, the wrenching contradiction that tore at the cynical armor he had so painstakingly forged. The voice was asking him to step into certain death, yet it spoke of love, of care, of a child waiting. It was a direct assault on the cynical fortress he had built around his heart, a beam of pure, unblemished light piercing the shadows of his despair. I listened, my own heart aching with a blend of profound sorrow and burgeoning hope. How many of us, I mused, mistake God's call for something sinister, something demanding, simply because it asks us to abandon our comfort, our logic, our carefully constructed safety nets? How often do we attribute a loving hand to a cruel fate, especially when it reaches into our deepest wounds, demanding not surrender, but trust? Michael, by his own account, stood at a precipice. On one side, the rational world, the world he knew, the world that had taught him self-preservation and the bitter lesson of loss. On the other, the unfathomable, the miraculous, the impossible directive from a voice that claimed a divine intimacy he had long rejected. The stakes were no longer just his life. They were his very soul. Caught in a profound spiritual crucible, he felt the tremors of an internal war. The ghost of his brother, trapped in flames a decade ago, whispered warnings of caution, of the cost of recklessness, of the ultimate futility of brave but foolish acts. His training, his duty to his crew, to not be a liability, screamed for him to stay put, to follow orders, to remain a cohesive part of the coordinated effort. But the voice persisted, a calm, unwavering presence amidst the tumult, offering not coercion, but a quiet, irrefutable truth. My child is waiting. That phrase, he told me, was the pivot point, the sacred wedge that finally splintered his resolve. It introduced a vulnerability, an innocence, a desperate need that resonated with a forgotten part of him, a part he thought long dead, buried beneath layers of grief and anger. A child. In that inferno, the man who had seen too much death, too much senseless loss, suddenly had a flicker of something to save, something pure amidst the ashes of his own despair. He described a surge of conflicting emotions, terror at the impossibility, profound confusion at the source, but also a nascent, almost imperceptible stirring of something long dormant, a feeling of purpose that transcended the sterile procedures of his job. This wasn't about putting out a fire. It was about answering a call, a deeply personal, divine summons. I imagined him standing there, the brutal heat of the fire on his face, the deafening roar in his ears, and this impossible quiet within, this sacred stillness. His gear, heavy and protective, suddenly felt like a cage, a barrier between him and this strange, compelling reality, a shell that once offered security, but now felt like an impediment. The world around him was chaotic, filled with shouts and the frantic spray of water, but he was isolated, wrapped in this profound, sacred moment, wrestling with the most monumental decision of his life. What courage, or perhaps what madness, it must have taken to even consider such a thing, to defy everything he knew, everything he was trained for, everything he had come to believe about the cold, indifferent universe, to entertain, even for a fleeting second, the possibility that the God he had long ago abandoned was now speaking to him, directly, personally, with an impossible task and an unshakable love. It was in that moment, I believe, that the first true crack appeared in the fortress of Michael Callahan's heart. Not a crack of fear, but of wonder, a terrifying, beautiful wonder at the audacity of the divine. Not a fissure of despair, but of a terrifying, exhilarating hope that something truly good, truly miraculous, might still exist in a world he had judged so harshly. The fire outside raged, consuming St. Jude's, but within Michael, a different kind of fire had just been kindled, the embers of a faith he thought long dead, fanned by the very breath of God. He stood there, on the brink, poised to make a choice that would defy all human logic, a choice that would either lead him to his doom or, as we now know, to a miracle that would forever redefine his understanding of grace. The choice was his, and the voice, absolute in its loving authority, waited. And he, the hollow man, Michael Callahan, stood ready to answer. He answered. In that split second, a choice was forged, not of logic, nor of training, but of an ancient, forgotten impulse, resurrected by a voice that bypassed the intellect and spoke directly to the soul. I saw it from my vantage point, though I could not comprehend it then. Michael, a man of such methodical discipline, broke. He tore free from Captain Miller's grasp with a sudden, violent twist that belied his usual calm. His helmet, dislodged, tumbled to the asphalt, and for a fleeting instant I saw his face, not the mask of professional duty, but a stark canvas of terror and incandescent purpose. He was no longer just a firefighter. He was a man seized by something beyond human understanding, propelled by a force I could only begin to name. "Michael, no! Get back here!" Captain Miller's shout was a desperate, guttural cry, quickly swallowed by the ravenous roar of the fire. Other shouts followed, a chorus of alarm and disbelief from the bewildered crew, but they were distant, fading echoes against the colossal symphony of destruction. Michael didn't so much as glance back. His gaze, fixed on the heart of the inferno that was St. Jude's, burned with a terrifying clarity. He took one step, then another, his heavy boots pounding a rhythm of defiance against the ground, carrying him not away from the danger, but directly into its embrace. My breath caught in my throat, a knot of ice and dread forming in my chest. My hands, without conscious thought, lifted, pressing together in the age-old posture of prayer. My lips moved, forming words I hadn't meant to utter, prayers I hadn't even consciously started. "Please, God, no, not another one. Not Michael." It was a raw, primal plea, born of a priest's love for his flock and a deep, agonizing fear. I had seen too much grief, too much loss. To watch this brave, broken man, who had already given so much, hurl himself into what appeared to be certain death, was an agony that pierced my very soul. I could only stand there, a helpless observer, my heart a living prayer, watching a silhouette of courage and madness vanish into the swirling smoke and hungry flames that writhed around the shattered rose window. What Michael experienced next, he recounted to me later, his voice still tinged with an awe that transcended the terror, a reverence that eclipsed the sheer impossibility of it all. He told me that the moment he crossed the threshold of St. Jude's, plunging back into the furnace, was unlike anything he had ever known. The inferno, which from the outside had seemed an indiscriminate maw of destruction, did not retreat. No, it was far more profound, far more personal than that. Instead, with a silent, breathtaking grace, a path opened before him. It was not a parting of the flames, not a sudden quenching of the fire, as one might imagine the Red Sea parting for Moses. Rather, Michael described it as a subtle, impossible reordering of chaos. The dense, choking smoke that billowed violently, swirling with superheated gases and burning embers, seemed to eddy and funnel itself, creating a tunnel, a clear passage just wide enough for him to walk through. The roaring tempest of the conflagration continued on either side, a furious, devouring beast. Yet within this narrow channel there was an inexplicable clarity, an almost ethereal calm. He told me the heat was still immense, a physical presence that pressed in on him, yet it was transformed. The flames, crimson and gold, dancing and licking at the very edges of his protected corridor, felt not like searing death, but like a warm, dry wind. He could feel its breath, smell the acrid tang of burning wood and fabric, hear the crackling symphony of combustion, but it was as though an invisible shield enveloped him. His heavy fire gear, designed to withstand such temperatures, certainly helped, But this was more than equipment. This was an anomaly, a defiance of physics. The air he breathed, though still smoke-tinged, was breathable, not the furnace-hot, lung-searing gas that should have instantly overwhelmed him. His mind, trained for efficiency and crisis management, screamed at the impossibility of it all. Every instinct, every fiber of his being, was honed to detect danger, to react, to protect himself. But here, in the heart of the danger, there was an unnatural sense of safety. He walked, not with the hurried, desperate scramble of a man fleeing death, but with a deliberate, guided pace. He felt as if he wasn't so much walking as being carried forward, propelled by an unseen current, drawn deeper into the very core of the fire. The church, once a sanctuary of quiet reverence, was now a skeletal ruin. Massive oak beams, their ancient wood blackened and splintered, groaned under the immense strain, shedding sparks like dying stars. The stained glass windows, those glorious depictions of saints and scripture, had long since shattered, their shards glittering malevolently on the floor, surrounded by a carpet of ash and burning debris. The smell of burning lacquer, smoldering velvet, and molten metal was overwhelming. Yet Michael walked through it all, seemingly immune to the dangers that raged around him. Then came the moment that, he later confessed, truly broke the last vestiges of his rational mind and brought him to his knees, metaphorically speaking. Ahead, a monumental oak beam, part of the main support structure for the nave, began to give way. It had been weakened by the intense heat, its connection to the charred stone wall visibly fraying. With a terrifying creak that echoed through the inferno, a sound like the groaning of a dying leviathan, it began to fall. Such a beam, centuries old and thicker than a man's torso, would have crushed him instantly. It tilted, slowly at first, then picked up momentum, its descent towards the very path Michael was traversing. Michael froze. His training, his survival instincts, screamed at him to duck, to run, to scramble for cover. But the invisible force that had been guiding him held him steady. He watched, mesmerized by the slow-motion ballet of destruction. The beam, just as it reached the apex of its terrifying arc, just as it was about to smash down upon him, stopped. It hung there, suspended. Michael told me he could hear the protesting shriek of metal, the splintering crack of wood, the very air vibrating with the immense energy of its impending fall. Yet it paused, held aloft by nothing visible for what felt like an eternity, though in truth it was likely only a second or two. It was just long enough. Long enough for Michael, still propelled by that gentle, insistent force, to pass directly beneath it. The moment he cleared its shadow, the beam, as if released from an invisible grasp, completed its fall with a thunderous crash that shook the very foundations of the burning church. Sparks erupted, debris flew, and the ground trembled beneath his feet. But Michael was already beyond it, moving forward, his heart hammering not with fear, but with a dawning, terrifying realization. This was not chance. This was not luck. This was something utterly, magnificently, terrifyingly divine. The voice, which had called his name, which had given the unholy command, returned not as an audible sound, but as an internal certainty. "My child is waiting." It resonated within him, a gentle but absolute command that eradicated all lingering doubt. This was real. This was a miracle. And it was happening to him, the hollow man, the man who had abandoned God, who had blamed him for everything. His footsteps, still oddly unhurried, took him deeper into the burning heart of St. Jude's. He passed what remained of the pews, now just smoldering outlines. The beautiful stations of the cross, once vibrant works of art, were reduced to charred fragments. Each step was a silent prayer, a silent confession of his profound error, his hardened heart, his years of bitter unbelief. The grief for his brother, a constant, dull ache he carried like a shroud, now felt different. It wasn't gone, but it was accompanied by a burgeoning, almost unbearable hope. Could it be? Could God truly be this intimately, profoundly present, even in the midst of such destruction, even for him? The smoke, dense as it was, thinned slightly, as he approached the general area of the main altar. The ceiling above was completely gone here, exposing the night sky, now a hazy red from the flames. This section of the church was the epicenter of the blaze, a swirling vortex of heat and light. But his path, the miraculous corridor, remained. It was guiding him with an unwavering purpose, pulling him like a magnetic force towards a specific point. The baptistery. He could see it now, through the shimmering heat and the eddying smoke. An alcove, a sacred space usually set apart, where new life in Christ was welcomed. It should have been swallowed whole by the inferno, a crucible of destruction. Yet, as he drew closer, the impossible quieted further. The roaring cacophony of the fire seemed to recede, replaced by a subtle, almost imperceptible hush. The air grew cooler, fresher, even sweeter. The impossible path led him directly, inexorably, to that very spot. He had arrived. The journey through the fire, defying every law of nature and man, was complete. He stood poised on the threshold of the deepest mystery, ready to witness what the voice had promised, to find the child waiting, a child he knew, with every fiber of his reawakened being, had been kept safe by a love beyond all earthly comprehension. He had arrived. The journey through the fire, defying every law of nature and man, was complete. He stood poised on the threshold of the deepest mystery, ready to witness what the voice had promised, to find the child waiting, a child he knew, with every fiber of his reawakened being, had been kept safe by a love beyond all earthly comprehension. And then he saw her. The baptistery, a small octagonal alcove set just off the main nave, was indeed there. But it was not as he had imagined, not a charred ruin or a smoldering shell. It stood like an island of profound peace in a sea of utter devastation. The flames, which elsewhere roared with the hunger of 1,000 beasts, seemed to hold a respectful distance, licking at the very edge of the stone archway, but never daring to intrude. Inside, the air was not merely cool, but almost impossibly fresh, carrying a faint, sweet scent, like spring rain on new earth. Michael, still wearing his full gear, felt the oppressive heat of the inferno recede, replaced by a gentle coolness that seeped into his bones, calming the frantic beat of his heart. The very walls of the baptistery, usually adorned with simple iconography, were untouched. The intricate stained glass window depicting the baptism of Christ, which should have shattered and melted in the heat, was perfectly intact, its colors glowing softly as if illuminated by an unseen internal light. The heavy, carved wooden doors leading into the space, which had been charred to cinders on the outside, were pristine on the inside. It defied every law of physics, every ounce of his extensive training, every cold, hard lesson of his experience. This was not a fire. This was a holy space, momentarily suspended from the grasp of earthly destruction. And there, at the base of the massive granite baptismal font, the very vessel that held the sacred waters of new life, was the child. A little girl, no older than 7, huddled against the cool stone. Her simple, pale blue dress was perfectly clean, without a speck of soot or ash. Her light brown hair, though slightly disheveled, was soft and untainted. Her small hands were clasped tightly around a worn wooden rosary, its beads smooth and dark from years of devotion. Her face, tear-streaked and smudged with what might have been dirt from earlier play, bore no marks of fear, only a quiet, almost serene anticipation. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and luminous in the glow filtering through the untouched stained glass. Michael stood, transfixed. The roar of the fire, though distant, was still a physical vibration in the air, a terrifying counterpoint to the absolute stillness within this miraculous sanctuary. He found himself unable to move, unable to speak, his mind struggling to reconcile the impossible vision before him with the harsh reality of the burning church just outside. His decade of doubt, his carefully constructed fortress of logic and scientific explanation, began to crumble, brick by agonizing brick, under the weight of this raw, undeniable truth. The girl did not cry out, did not flinch from his smoke-stained, helmeted presence. Instead, a tiny, relieved smile touched her lips. Her voice, soft and clear like a chime, cut through the profound silence in the baptistery, reaching Michael's ears with an intimacy that seemed to bypass all physical barriers and resonate directly in his soul. "I knew you would come," she said, her voice entirely calm, entirely without fear. She let go of the rosary with one hand and pointed a small, delicate finger past him towards the inferno that raged just beyond the sanctuary. "The man made of light told me to wait for Michael. My friends." Michael recounted those words to me later, his voice still trembling with awe, even weeks after the event. He said that in that moment, the entire universe seemed to tilt on its axis. The man made of light, the voice that had called him by name, the authority that had commanded him back into the heart of the fire, the loving presence that had guided his every step. It coalesced into a radiant, undeniable truth. It was not a hallucination. It was not a trick of the mind. It was a manifestation of the divine, speaking directly to a child, calling a broken man back to faith. He knelt slowly, his heavy gear feeling weightless. His knees, which had been so quick to bow only in exhaustion or despair, now bending in an act of profound, involuntary reverence. He reached out a hand, calloused and scarred, towards the child. She did not hesitate. Her small, warm hand slipped into his, her touch a spark that reignited a forgotten warmth deep within him. "Hello," he managed, his voice thick with emotions he hadn't felt in a decade. Awed wonder, agonizing sorrow for his disbelief, and an overwhelming surge of love, pure and unbidden, for this innocent creature, so utterly preserved by grace. He lifted her gently into his arms. She was light, feather-light, and completely compliant. He noticed then that the rosary she had been clutching was nestled now within her lap, but it was not merely wood and string. A soft, almost ethereal glow emanated from it, a luminescence that pulsed gently, like a heartbeat of pure light, visible only to him, or so he believed. He held her close, feeling the impossible coolness of her body against his own, which was still radiating the lingering heat from his harrowing journey. The thought of escaping, of getting her to safety, became his singular focus. He turned. The girl nestled against his chest, her head resting near his shoulder, her small, trusting hand now resting on his helmet. As he did, the way back seemed to open once more. The invisible hand that had guided him in now gently propelled him out. The inferno, still roaring, still a wall of unbearable heat and toxic smoke to anyone else, merely parted for them. Flames that should have consumed them flickered and danced away. The collapsing beams, the showers of burning debris, the superheated gases, they all held their breath, or altered their course, or simply ceased to be a threat along the precise, narrow path ordained for their passage. He walked as if in a dream, yet every step was real. Every beat of his heart thrummed with a new, terrifying, glorious certainty. He moved through a world consumed by fire, carrying a child untouched by it, guided by a presence that whispered not of danger, but of boundless love. And then he emerged. He stepped out of the choking smoke and the blinding glare of the inferno, back into the controlled chaos of the fireground. He walked past the perimeter lines, past the hosing crews and the rescue vehicles, his heavy boots crunching on fallen embers and shattered glass. His face, still smeared with soot, was no longer a mask of grim determination. It was a canvas of disbelief, of awe, and a dawning, shattering tenderness. The shouts of the fire chief, the insistent blare of truck sirens, the hiss of water hitting superheated metal, all faded into a sudden, profound, almost spiritual silence. Every single firefighter, every officer, every emergency responder, every volunteer and bystander within sight froze. Their hoses fell silent. Their tools lay still. Their faces, grimy and tired, turned as one to behold the impossible sight. Michael Callahan, the hollow man, the fearless automaton, stood before them, bathed in the orange glow of the dying fire. holding a small, perfectly clean child in his arms. She was safe. She was whole. She was, quite simply, a miracle. No one moved. No one spoke. Only the crackle of the distant flames and the ragged breaths of 100 stunned witnesses filled the air. It was a silence deeper than any sound, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most profound truths are whispered not in words, but in the hush that follows the impossible. The hush, my dear friends, that followed Michael's emergence from the inferno was unlike any silence I have ever known. It wasn't merely the absence of sound, but the presence of something utterly overwhelming, a truth too vast for human utterance. We stood there, rooted to the spot, our collective breath held captive by the impossible tableau. Michael, the hardened firefighter, holding a small child, both perfectly intact, against a backdrop of a raging, destructive fire. It defied every law of nature, every expectation of tragedy. It was grace made manifest. Her name, we soon learned, was Lily. She was the granddaughter of a tourist couple from out of state, their car having broken down a few miles outside town. While her grandparents sought help for a flat tire, she, with the innocent curiosity of a 7-year-old, had wandered into what she thought was an inviting, quiet place, our beautiful St. Jude's, just moments before the first tendrils of smoke appeared. No one had known she was missing until the fire was already well underway, and then only a frantic call to the emergency services after they had seen the news reports of the blaze. How could she have survived? That was the question that hung in the smoke-filled air, unspoken but palpable in every gaze. Not a hair singed, not a speck of soot on her dress, her small hands still clutching a worn wooden rosary as if it were a sacred talisman. The air in that sacrosanct baptistery, Michael would later recount, was cool, breathable, a pocket of serene peace in the very heart of hell. To dismiss it as luck, as a freak anomaly, would have been to deny the very witness of our own eyes, the collective gasp of disbelief that had rippled through the assembled crowd. There was no scientific explanation, no logical deduction that could reconcile the inferno Michael had entered with the pristine child he carried out. Only the quiet, unsettling recognition of something beyond our understanding, something truly divine. Michael, too, stood as if sculpted from the very earth, his helmet still clutched in one hand, Lily safe in the other. The mask of efficient detachment that had defined him for so long was shattered. His face, streaked with sweat and ash, was nakedly human, a kaleidoscope of shock, bewilderment, and a nascent, fragile wonder I hadn't seen in his eyes since he was a boy, before grief had built its formidable walls. He answered questions in a hushed, almost dazed voice, recounting his journey through the flames with a profound humility that bordered on terror. He didn't speak of heroism, he spoke of guidance, of an invisible hand, of a clear path that simply was. He spoke, too, of the voice, and of Lily's simple assertion that the man made of light told me to wait for Michael. Nuidik, it was clear to all who listened that Michael Callahan had not merely entered a burning building, he had stepped into a revelation. A few days later, after Lily had been safely reunited with her tearful grandparents, and the initial investigations into the fire's cause began, a short circuit in the old organ's wiring, they determined, my rectory doorbell rang. It was late, the evening drawing its cloak of quiet over the town. When I opened the door, it wasn't the Michael Callahan I had known for years who stood on my stoop. This man was no longer hollow. He was broken, not broken in despair, but broken open, like a vessel finally shedding its hardened shell to reveal the precious contents within. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes red-rimmed, and the quiet strength he usually possessed seemed to have given way to a profound vulnerability that was, paradoxically, stronger than any facade. I ushered him in, offering him a cup of tea, but he shook his head, his gaze fixed on the small crucifix above my fireplace. Then, without a word, he simply fell to his knees. It was not a grand gesture, but a collapsing, a surrender born of overwhelming truth. He didn't ask for the sacrament of reconciliation in the usual way, listing his trespasses. No, what poured from him was a confession of a different kind. It was a torrent, a dam burst after a decade of holding back. Awe, yes, for what he had witnessed, for the undeniable hand of God. Gratitude, immense and heart-shaking, for being chosen, for being shown such a profound mercy. But beneath it all, and perhaps most poignantly, was a deep, guttural sorrow for his years of doubt, for the fortress he had built around his heart, keeping God and grace at bay. He spoke of his brother, Jimmy, the raw wound that had never truly healed. For years, his grief had manifested as anger. Anger at God for taking such a vibrant young life. Anger at faith for offering no solace. Anger at himself for surviving. He blamed. He raged. He closed himself off. But that night, as he knelt before me, his tears were different. They were hot, yes, but they were cleansing. He wept for Jimmy, deeply and truly, but for the first time there was no bitterness, no accusation in his voice. There was only a tender sorrow, mingled with a new, astonishing hope. He spoke of seeing Jimmy again, not as a desperate wish, but as a quiet conviction, as if the path through the fire had also revealed a glimpse of the communion of saints. He confessed his hardness of heart, his willful turning away, his belief that God had abandoned him. And as he spoke, his voice hoarse with emotion, the weight of a decade of bitterness seemed to lift from his shoulders. I listened, offered absolution, and then simply sat with him in the quiet, holy space of my rectory, as the true miracle unfolded. The Michael Callahan who had walked in, broken and trembling, began to breathe again, deeply, truly. The light that had flickered and died within him 10 years ago, rekindled by an impossible voice, a path through fire, and a child untouched by flames, now blazed anew. The God he had blamed for taking his brother had, indeed, used a fire, a terrifying, destructive inferno, not to punish, but to love, to reveal his unfathomable grace, and to give Michael Callahan back his very soul. The Michael Callahan who had walked in, broken and trembling, began to breathe again, deeply, truly. The light that had flickered and died within him 10 years ago, rekindled by an impossible voice, a path through fire, and a child untouched by flames, now blazed anew. The God he had blamed for taking his brother had, indeed, used a fire, a terrifying, destructive inferno, not to punish, but to love, to reveal his unfathomable grace, and to give Michael Callahan back his very soul. St. Jude's, our beloved chapel, stood for weeks as a stark, skeletal reminder of what we had lost. The bell tower had indeed collapsed, the roof gone, the beautiful rose window a gaping, charred eye. It was a ruin, yes, but from its ashes, something far more profound began to rise, a powerful, communal faith reborn in the heart of our struggling parish. The story of Michael Callahan and the child from the fire, the one no one knew was missing, spread like wildfire itself, but this time a purifying, illuminating flame. It became our story, a modern testament echoing the ancient wonders, whispered first in awe, then spoken in wonder, then accepted as a profound truth. God had not abandoned us, even in our darkest trials, in the very heart of the inferno. I watched Michael closely in the weeks and months that followed, and what I saw was not merely a man restored, but a man transformed. The hollow-driven firefighter I had known for so long had vanished. In his place stood a man whose quiet strength was no longer empty, but filled with the unwavering light of profound conviction. He carried a new peace, a humble radiance that drew others to him. He became a captain within his department, his leadership now imbued with a spiritual depth that inspired trust and courage in his crew, not just professional respect. He leads our men's prayer group now, his baritone voice a steady anchor as he reads from Scripture, and I often see him, after a long shift, the scent of smoke still clinging to his uniform, being the first to offer comfort to those who grieve. He speaks not of platitudes, but of the very real, terrifying, and ultimately loving presence of God in the midst of suffering. He knows of what he speaks, you see. Our community rallied, of course. We rebuilt St. Jude's, brick by brick, prayer by prayer. It stands today, not as a monument to what was lost, but as a beacon of what can be found. The baptismal font, miraculously preserved amidst the devastation, now graces the center of our newly consecrated space, a constant reminder of the day a child waited, untouched by fire, for a man called by name. I often see Michael there, kneeling before the new altar, his head bowed, his hands resting gently on the cool stone of the font. In those moments, he is not just a firefighter, not just a captain. He is a man in dialogue with the divine, a living testament to grace. For I have learned, dear friends, that sometimes God does not calm the storm, nor does he quench the fire. Instead, he makes a path directly through it. He calls us, by name, to come walk with him, to trust in his unseen hand, to find the impossible pockets of peace in the heart of chaos. He does not always remove our suffering, but he promises to walk with us through it. And sometimes, in his infinite, incomprehensible wisdom, he uses the very things that threaten to destroy us to lead us back home, to him, and to the deepest, most radiant truth of who we are meant to be. And that, my friends, is the greatest miracle of all.